Okay, well, let's go. And we know who I am, where we are, what's the date. Now, over the years, the RF&P, which is the short form of the long words used to identify the railroad, had several nicknames. One I've heard often is it was this entity suitable only for rich folks and preachers. Now, of course, the preachers back in those days got a discount for clergy. A friend who was a native of Richmond told me that no, he had heard it more likely as what you were going to have to do was run fast and push. I don't think this happened very often, however. My first acquaintanceship since I grew up in Ohio and New York with the RF&P was a blue and gray timetable, obtained likely from the Cincinnati Union Terminal, where I frequented when people were going and coming. And of course, the blue and the gray represented I guess, what's called the recent unpleasantness between the North and the South. The RF&P, it struck me when I was a youngster and looking at this that, of course, you only saw passenger trains in the timetable, but it seemed to be fairly unique in as much as it only ran trains for the Atlantic Coastline and Seaboard Airline. It didn't seem to have any of its own. And it's my understanding that past the mid-1950s, that was certainly the case. Well, even by the 60s, there were still quite a few passenger trains on the RF&P because people were going between the Northeast and Southeast, particularly New York and Florida. When I started going to school in Lexington in the Shenandoah Valley, I often took the train between Washington and New York, so this gave me my first personal look at the RF&P. Here's a look at the engine facility at Ivy City Yard in D.C. in the mid-60s. Unfortunately, I don't happen to have a slide showing RF&P units, but one of those could have been where that ACL unit is, so that'll give you an idea of what it was. And of course, in the background, you've got what was, at that point, actively the Hecht warehouse, and I think now has been incorporated into some sort of shopping mall or grocery or something like that. Well, finally made it to real RF&P territory in January of 1969 when a friend and I, on our way back to school, decided to spend a day in Richmond looking at basically passenger trains. Here's the southbound Everglades behind it's either an E3 or an E6, face full of steam. Northbound Everglades, and these were the more prominent trains in the daytime on the RF&P back then. And of course, now the dome building is the Virginia Science Museum. Mm-hmm. To the right, you can see the concourse where passengers walked out to get on the trains or when they were coming in.
That was the Broad Street station, I guess?
Yes, it was. Yeah, we went briefly to Main Street, but obviously there was a lot more activity going on at Broad. And by that time, the SAL trains were no longer stopping at Main Street. We caught the southbound Silver Star. This was one of the B&O's what were called bird sleepers because they were all named for bird species. This one is Oriole, which is, of course, is very appropriate for a Baltimore-based railroad. By that point, they were the economy sleeping cars. They were used instead of slumber coaches or sleeper coaches on other railroad. Here is, interestingly, Richmond at that point still merited a sleeping car that was taken off the train northbound, put on southbound that went to and from Miami. And one interesting thing about that was the Silver Star and Silver Meteor, the trains couldn't turn same day, but this sleeping car saved an entire car because you could turn at Richmond and it was tacked onto the rear end. Little known was in this time period, there were actually dome cars being used on the now Seaboard coastline south of Richmond. These were a pair of the dome sleepers that had been operating on the Capital Limited on the B&O and also the Shenandoah on an every other day basis. Now, unfortunately, most of this portion of the ride was at night, but you could still sit in the dome and look at it if you want. Here's the southbound Silver Star getting ready for departure. It was becoming late in the day in January at this point. Well, my next encounter with the RF&P involved the Penn Central. I had to show this. This was a Penn Central ticket envelope because somebody must have been high on some substance. This was the 1960s, of course, when it says, putting more pleasure in your travel, Penn Central. Incongruous is about my only description of that. Here is my multi-carrier ticket for a coach seat between New York and Richmond. And take a look at this. It's sort of standard issue. It's a reserve seat because the Meteor all coach seats were reserved, and there was a charge for that, $2.50. But there's something a little strange here. The clerk at Penn Station in New York apparently thought that south of Washington, D.C., the seaboard coastline took over and hence put in SCL, whereas in fact that was not going to occur until after I got off the train in Richmond. And in those easier economic times, $15.90 would get this plus $2.50 on the reserve seat for $18 the entire way. Didn't happen to photograph that train, but I put this in to show where I enjoyed riding for most of the trip. One of the Seaboard's post-war tavern lounge observations, which had a marvelous view and a mounted fish on the overhead in the center over the bar. By now, Amtrak is in vogue. This is 1975, and here we are in Alexandria. You'll notice there are quite a few less buildings than would be in this shot today. And here's the northbound Silver Star with a pair of SDP 40Fs. The Amtrak Florida trains at that point were huge. Now, admittedly, the Amfleet coaches in particular they use now have a lot more seats in them, but they look puny compared to this train, which is now headed north towards Washington Union Station. The Southern also used Alexandria Union Station. Here is their Lynchburg local. This was reflecting Amtrak and Southern not joining. They had to continue to run this, so they towed piggyback cars up to their Alexandria yard, and then they took the sole coach, which was more than sufficient for most of the patronage, on up to Union Station. Here we have a traffic jam at Alexandria. 3 of the 4 tracks occupied with the Southern freight coming out of Potomac Yard, northbound RF&P freight, and then the Lynchburg local on the Southern. Here's a better look at the Southern in its tuxedo scheme as it approaches from the freight track side of Alexandria Union Station. And in the not distant future, thanks to the state of Virginia, there will again be 4 tracks at this location. Northbound RF&P intermodal, although they were simply called piggyback trains back then. Here it is meeting a switcher that's come out from Potomac Yard, maybe to work the rear end of its train. Anybody recognize or have one of these? This is what you did so you didn't get thrown out of railroad property when you simply showed up and walked onto it. Not everyone would do this. The B&O was, of course, well known for many years, but I'd heard Potomac Yard was a very difficult place to get into and not get in trouble. I walked over to the office. They reached in a drawer, produced this license, typed in the appropriate information. We signed and countersigned it, and I was off. It was a good thing I had because I walked out and I immediately encountered the railroad policeman and was about to reach my pocket and pull out the release, the license. And he said, "Don't bother, I saw you walk in." So I asked him how I would get down to a southern point in the yard that I'd seen from the road, US 1, to get a better view of some of the units. And he said, "The best way to do that is to hop in my car and I will take you." So playing by the rules does have its merits, particularly on occasion. There's a slug set in the background. Of course, this is still under wires. Conrail was bringing down, Conrail was bringing down freights. We'll see this locomotive again at a quite different location. But of course, one of the nuances of the RF&P is their locomotives, you could tell which direction the train was going in because the odd numbered locomotives face south and the even numbers face north per timetable direction. This B&O chassis system GP30 was fairly new at that point, was still in pretty nice shape. I think a lot of people missed that paint scheme. A couple years later, I was back in the Washington area. By this time, I was living in Atlanta, caught the auto train on the adjacent to the US 1 bridge at Woodbridge. This wasn't a bad place to shoot, except you were basically standing in the shoulder of US 1 with trucks and automobile traffic going by at 50 plus mile an hour. It was not a pleasant place to wait. I came back with one of my college friends and we stopped at Lorton to see southbound manifest on the RF&P. And here's my first shot ever at Neabsco, a place, as you'll see, that I've been more frequently in recent years. I was sort of disappointed initially, but when I got the slide back from processing, I thought, I'm glad I have this. Trains Magazine used it on a calendar at one point. And no, it's not sunny and pleasantly lit, It's basically almost a silhouette, but I like the mood of it considerably. Also saw both Silver Stars. Here's the northbound version while we were there. Now, you won't have to search far to answer the question, but this picture of an RF&P Jeep is in a very strange location. Atlanta, Georgia, and the what was formerly the L&N's Tilford Yard. What is it doing there? Well, it turned out that CSX by then was having trouble competing with the NS on the route north for intermodal traffic between Atlanta and the Northeast. So they dreamed up a scheme where by running the RF&P lead locomotive all the way to Atlanta, they could save 5 or 10 minutes changing engines in Pot Yard. This ran for a period of several weeks during the late summer of 1988. Here's CSX train 190, interestingly, not going up the old seaboard, but on the Georgia Road at Clarkston, Georgia, not too far from downtown Atlanta, a place called Conyers, finally at Social Circle, where there was actually a local freight unit, although they didn't pause there. This didn't do the trick and was discontinued shortly after that, but it gave rail fans in Atlanta a chance to see an RF&P locomotive not only in service, but you could be very sure it was going to lead. Well, by this time, I'd moved up to Northern Virginia, and once I got settled, was able to get out and went back to Neabsco. Here is late in the career of what were called the Pooches, the General Electric P30CHs. All 4 of these, I think, were actually working that day. They had quite a bad reputation by that time. I never saw an RF&P piggybacker intermodal train with only a single unit this one time, and I happened to be driving down US 1, saw a headlight, pulled off, and fortunately there was a nice open area in front of me and was able to get this shot. Now we're down at Arkandale between Alexandria and Fredericksburg. This is the northbound Silver Star, still with pretty large consist, but now Amfleet coaches. The nice bridge at Aquia, and you can see other CSX motive power, but still RF&P units that will lead and trail depending on whether it's north or south. Potomac Yard, southbound intermodal train 171 going to Florida with one of the Amtrak Virginia trains passing it on the left. And they apparently had recovered some traffic to the Mid-South. So here is 191 with what looks like a good consist just south of Crystal City on the same day. This was unusual. It is properly pointed in terms of number, but here you have the 133 leading freight Q405 past the Alexandria station and the Alexandria Metro station on the right. Anybody want to guess how many trees that are in the background are still there? I say 0. And here it is at the top of Franconia Hill, beginning to accelerate. Another long hood forward at Neabsco with Conrail power. With the waning days of dome cars on the auto train, which was a wonderful thing, although the P30s are gone by now. You can see the middle unit is a former GP40 modified for service on GO Transit in Ontario with electrical power. This was my first real up-close encounter with trash once it began running in the RF&P. It typically ran on train 409, and I happened to witness a meet between 409 and a northbound freight right after this, and they exchanged greetings on the radio, and the northbound said to the 409, "You look good, you smell bad." These are the newest days of what became the P40s. I think they were something like AMD 102s, but they're referred to as Genesis units. When they came new, they had this fade paint scheme at the back end of the unit where it went to a dot matrix pattern. But of course, they were fresh and new. And look, we're coming up on 40 years here. Now here is a southbound train that came down with Conrail units and is going to pick up the RF&P leader in that cut of cars that's in the right side of the picture. And of course, that's the Highway 1 bridge over Potomac Yard. So now the RF&P unit has come out. It's put the cars that were in the yard at the head of the train, and it can now lead south to Richmond. This is photographed at that first metro station just north of Alexandria.
Mhm.
Woodford, if you look at the left, you can see that the Pepsi generation of the 60s lived on into the 90s. I'm not sure remnants of that sign are still there, but it lasted an awful lot of time. The paint job was quite good. And of course, by that time, the Woodford passenger station had been moved somewhat aside in the field. Here's the northbound Palmetto. No, I'm sorry, the northbound Carolinian. This location was referred to years ago as Olive. This is where the end of the line storage and maintenance facility is on the Fredericksburg line, and it's now referred to as XR, or that means actually Crossroads. You can see the line going back to the in the background. Here's a high and wide with metal slabs at Possum Point. Now, I thought the Possum Point power plant was closing, but I was down there a couple of months ago and it seemed to be still working. This was an absolute last light shot as well. I was lucky to get the unit with as much sun as it has. Down at Guinea, near the Stonewall Jackson Shrine, there were some really nice irises. I have not seen them in subsequent years, but here is again northbound train 80, the Carolinian, and this one of the southbound intermodals, 175. It was a nice chance to be able to get a little more color in the picture with the flowers in the foreground. This ferry boat, or what was supposed to look like a ferry boat, or I'm sorry, steamboat, not a ferry boat, lived at Fredericksburg for a season or two, but I have not seen it in recent years. Now, I will point out, can you see my arrow moving? I'm not sure, but if you can,
Yep.
we'll see a picture of these later that will mean something different. This was the Northeast Direct scheme that was applied to the later P-42s when they came. Just after sunrise at Neabsco in the fall of October 2000, Q-74 heading north over the trestle. The southbound Carolinian now in the phase 4 scheme at Brook, Virginia, on the curve there. This is at Guinea, obviously in the fall. This was referred to, I'm not sure it ever had an official designation, but this was supposed to be the adaptation of the Acela paint scheme for Amfleet cars. It was referred to by fans as the lava lamp scheme because there appeared to be these blobs in random places on the sides of the window panel. Here we have the southbound auto train heading out onto the main line at Lorton, while train number 90, the Palmetto, is going by on the northbound main. One of the neat things about going to Fredericksburg is the arch bridge there. If the water is still, you can get the reflection making complete circles. And more often than not, there's enough motion in the water or wind that you can't do this. HN Tower, where the CNO's line going to Charlottesville crossed the RF&P at Doswell. This is now Buckingham Branch. Here's the tank ramp at Guinea, Virginia. If you're not familiar with it, it looks like a piggyback ramp, except it's quite short, but it's also a massive solid hunk of concrete. This has been used, I think, in fairly recent times. What was that? I think it's Fort A.P. Hood. I can't remember what its newer name is. Was within 5 miles of here or so, and they used it to get armor that came by rail in and out of the fort. Here's a little more recent view of the juice train, K650 at Aquia, Virginia. And notice 20 years ago, you don't see any graffiti, do you?
No.
And obviously, this was towards the end of the transition between the orange Tropicana reefers and when they were painted white. Although one of the old ones apparently sat someplace long enough, it did get some graffiti. Neabsco was a good place to shoot the commuter rush in the RF&P on the Fredericksburg line. Started off with conventional Jeeps that were equipped with head-end power to light and heat and cool. There was a period of time when General Electric had a backlog in its paint shops, and they were delivering locomotives to both the Norfolk Southern and the CSX in primer paint. They were referred to as gray ghosts on the RF&P, I've heard. There were far more on the Norfolk Southern for some reason. We don't get a lot of snow in Northern Virginia, but this is Neabsco with a little covering of it, and there's a high rail going across the trestle. A southbound VRE commuter train, number 305, with the northbound juice, with the reflections of the commuter train's headlights. Until recently, you didn't see foreign power other than CSX locomotives with train stop equipment on them on the RF&P. So you could have interesting looking locomotives from elsewhere, but they didn't lead. That's now changed, of course, with positive traffic control. And on March 5th, 2007, a train that was looked at and photographed, I suspect, multiple times, the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Combined Circus came north as train P922. The Neabsco proved to be a good place to get pictures of much of the consist. Now, the passenger cars, which were basically painted silver with just the emblems, weren't terribly interesting, but when you get back further in the train, some of the equipment used to set up and take down the shows, to transport things, some of those vehicles were used by performers in the shows, so they'd have something to drive with at the show venues while they were waiting between shows. But it was impressive to see. And it looks like the bus they used to shuttle performers to and from the arena brought up the rear end. I suspect many of you know what this is, but they're not seen that often, and you have to actually look for them, and often that's frustrating too. But this is a compromised joint bar. What you can see is on the left, there's a 130-pound per yard rail, which is slightly smaller than the 140-pound rail to which it's connected on the right, so that you have to have basically a shim under the smaller rail to get it to the same elevation as the heavier rail on the right. And here's how that looks. And this is on a side track at Guinea. You can see where it is with the main line in the background. These are interesting things to record, although you don't see them very often. Part of it is side tracks have more or less disappeared. Here is these cars now were sold to Mark. At one point, both VRE and Mark were using the same kind of bi-levels. But then VRE purchased a different type and sold the cars like this to Mark, where they were put into that fleet. I don't know what possessed somebody to paint coal hoppers in white, but these were called Snows because John Snow was the CEO at that point. And this is about the cleanest I ever saw them once they got into service, because dust around coal mines, not to mention coming off the trains themselves, can be pretty miserable. I suspect some of you in the chapter will know the guy climbing back onto his seat in the cab. That's now retired engineer Doug Riddell.
Oh, okay.
And notice Doug is bearing a camera quite openly. I thought they weren't supposed to do that on duty, but I guess you can't stop Doug from taking pictures. And as far as I know, all of his runs got there safely while he was still in service. Sometimes you just wait and hope and pray that the light is going to last long enough. I could hear the juice train Q740 by then on the radio, on the scanner. And yeah, I've got it at the absolute last light as it came into the curve at Alexandria. Here are the pear trees in bloom at Fredericksburg in March of 2009 on the D794 local that comes up from Richmond to Fredericksburg. Often see fishermen at the park down in Fredericksburg, and here's Auto Train with a trio of P42s. There's a location taxi and limo drivers often wait there. It's right off the George Washington Parkway, just opposite Crystal City. There's a stream that comes into the Potomac there called Roach's Run. I haven't been back there in years. I suspect this has become more grown over, but while it lasted, it was a fun place to photograph trains in the morning, both passenger and freight, as we can see here with Hotshot Intermodal Q174 and some of the Crystal City hotels in the background. Another commuter train at Neabsco with counterpoint in red, white, and blue to the left. Here's the overnight. At one point was the Twilight Shoreliner, but the sleeper has vanished, crossing the Powell's Creek Trestle on its way south. At that point, it was going to Newport News. Not long after that, Q135 with its intermodals heading west went by. And of course, this had to be single stacked until recently. There is a place in Leesylvania Park that at least 5 or 10 years ago you could see the Potomac side of Neabsco off one of the trails, but I think that's all overgrown now. But this was a nice fall scene with the auto train going by. And here's from the car top boat launch, also in Powell's Creek in Leesylvania Park, which is another nice place all morning. Ballast cars at Fredericksburg. There's an afternoon revenue return train on the Manassas line of the VRE. Passengers actually ride it. And if you're lucky, you can get a nose-to-nose meet. That's the return train on the right, and VRE 327 coming out going to Manassas also on the left. Good timing, friends. Alexandria is a nice place to get some mood shots as well. Now, you've heard that expression, I'm sure, of so-and-so is just a shadow of his or her former self. Well, these people must be really impressive, judging by the size of their shadows. They're waiting to go home. And this woman commuter is getting closer to the platform now that she sees her train arriving. Nice shot of the George Washington Memorial behind a Manassas line train awaiting departure. And of course, one of the better things about commuting by rail is you can get up and talk to somebody who's sitting behind you. Nobody cares if you use a device, an electronic or whatever, and you can sit there and relax. Here's another north and southbound shot with the lights of the southbound really lighting up the cars on the incoming train on the right. Digital photography has made quite a difference in getting shots like that. That's the Featherstone interlocking signals on the left. This is just north of Neabsco, south of Woodbridge, and that water is often still, and you can get a nice reflection. Except in the summer, the water is often green with algae. This was Amtrak equipment that had been to an exhibit someplace, including one of the heritage units that's coming back, crossing the bridge at Neabsco. Unusual double-headed locomotive on the outbound commuter train. The Phase 4 heritage unit coming across the Powell's Creek Bridge. Commuters on their way home at Alexandria. The train seems to have some sort of vacuum or magnetic attraction. It just sucks people in. You stand there and the train stops and they all teleport inside. Works very well. This was what desperate photographers will do. There was obviously no decent light to work with. I knew this heritage unit was coming from. And I said, I'll try a pan and I'll work. And it worked. So I quit complaining and kept it. That's Amtrak conductor Patrick Cordemonch, waiting departure on 171 at that point to Lynchburg with plane landing at Reagan National overhead in the background. Here is Tim's River Shore, which was a seafood restaurant, no longer there. This was at the Cherry Hill grade crossing. And of course, there's a huge housing development going in just to the north of this. A space that's opened up is in the park near the soccer fields in Arlington. Now, at one point, you could see the Capitol in the background, but the tree growth is taking care of that. This is South RO. If you turn to the right, you can see Reagan National Airport and get a good view of that. If the wind is out of the north, the airplanes will be taking off and turning overhead as they go up the Potomac River. Fall foliage shot of the Amtrak veterans, the diesel Amtrak veterans unit. The electric is still there, but the diesel has not run in years. I have never gotten a nose-to-nose meet in all the times I've been at Neabsco. But I got this one at Powell's Creek, and I got another one that was a near also. Was very pleased to have it. Here's the auto train taking one of the switchers from Sanford in Florida to come up for maintenance. Back when the Veterans Unit was running, a little better look at it there. Yes, there is a train in this picture, but the way I framed it in the camera, the only part of it you can see is its reflection. And these look like containers also, but sometimes you can have a little fun with the camera. Now, I've got to absolutely congratulate the dispatchers for this. I could hear Amtrak 67 coming, and Q416 was coming in the opposite direction. And sure enough, Q416 started blocking the view. But right as Amtrak 67 went by, everything were empty pulpwood flats, and you can see almost the entire consist. I mean, absolutely great job by the dispatchers and locomotive engineers. Here's the Phase 1 Heritage Unit heading north at Alexandria in the early morning. That's my ride coming up on the right. That's train 67. I went to Newport News for the day. Now, the last thing in the world I thought I would see on my trip to and from Newport News, and I actually took the AM bus over to see the new Norfolk station in the process, was a large four-engine heavy jet transport. But that's at the Quantico Marine Base at the airport there. Here's our conductor doing some paperwork. Absolute different ethos or atmosphere south of D.C. You go into a cafe car in the Northeast Corridor, and there's barely room to move around half the time. People with their laptops are taking up all the seats. This cafe car was essentially empty. During that period, the citizens of Ashland, Virginia, were all excited because there was talk of putting a third main track through. Well, it goes down the main street in their town, and they put up a substantial sign outburst in protest and under the guise of no third rail. Now, of course, third rail means something else to railroaders. That's typically the electrical power source for commuter. But in any case, I guess you could say they were successful because it hasn't happened yet. Here's a look at 67 on a different day, making the stop at Ashland, that's a great place to go watch trains, and you've got food, food, drink nearby, places to eat, even a hobby shop. This is a neat location. It's near what it's called the Boulevard Bridge. At one point, it charged a nickel toll. I think the toll is up to 50 cents or a buck now, but it's well worth it. That's the north end of the RF&P ACL bridge where they meet in the center, and south of it is Atlantic Coastline or former coastline, and then north of that is RF&P. That's the C&O's James River line. This is a place called Reservoir that they often hold out the coal trains until they're ready for them at Fulton Yard. And it's not a great number of places that I know that you can get pictures of two loaded coal trains going in different directions in the same shot.
I drove across that nickel bridge when it wasn't nickel.
Wow. Well, and then there's one thing. You have to stand out there. But you have to be very careful because particularly on weekends, bicyclists like to use that bridge, and they get annoyed with people standing there because there's not much room. So it pays to watch out for them and to compress yourself to be as thin as possible when they show up. Oh, this looks so much better now. I've seen the train since it was repainted into B&O colors, but that medium blue was just dull beyond belief. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to photograph at this spot the new train. Here's another shot at Alexandria showing the Washington Masonic Memorial in the background, freight and passenger moving. Now, remember when I pointed out those benches in the park at Fredericksburg? I'd heard they'd had pretty heavy rains, but I didn't realize they were like this. That's one of them down there in the lower right-hand corner. Just water all over the place. A Viewliner diner, which I have yet to eat in. And finally, double stacks have appeared on the RF&P. This is a silhouette of them on Q135 going out to the Midwest Sorting Center near Tiffin, Ohio. Jones Crossing. Now, this is very interesting. when they installed positive train control, you can see the old signal heads on the top, well weathered and worn. This is the only example I've seen where they installed the new Darth Vader signals on the same mast and they used the two of them jointly. This is the Midnight Blue unit honoring the fact that Amtrak works 24/7. So-called Pepsi can special unit. This was one of the better opportunities for special Amtrak units I've ever seen. In a period of an hour and a half, 2 hours, saw the 50 years, number 46. This is the like the P7, the Phase 7 scheme. And then finally, the new version of the Phase 2 scheme, all in about, 90 minutes. They say it's lonely at the top, and here's a picture of it. This appeared to be local power coming south out of Aki Yard to work in the industrial area south of Richmond proper. And here, in just a wonderful, I didn't know how this was going to come out, but perfect side view of the morning train coming up from Norfolk showing the entire consist. This is at that same spot near the Boulevard Bridge. Siemens locomotives, the Chargers are now starting to show up in the RF&P. I mean, here's the Palmetto southbound. C&O Heritage unit. Now, interestingly, I didn't know it at the time, but that boxcar labeled prominently "Do Not Hump" is one of their rolling track analyzer cars. It's got all sorts of electronic equipment in it, records, takes pictures, etc., in real time of the track structure. So if you see one of those, you'll know what it's doing, and it typically operates right behind the locomotives. This is one of the more striking schemes. This was put up by the Operation Lifesaver grade crossing people. I guess it's, both they and the sign are in favor of no trespassing. Of course, the sign was contemplating pedestrians on the track. Now, I couldn't have included this in an RF&P presentation years ago, but the present CFP subdivision goes all the way past L'Enfant Plaza. So here's a shot of the cherry blossoms a year ago with the Conrail CSX Heritage Unit.
What's that building there on the left?
That belongs to the Park Service. I'm not sure what it does. And was back in Fredericksburg. This is the auto train, which has begun sort of off and on to run with Siemens units. There was a northbound regional train. They were seeing it in probably a little better light than I was. And they came on the radio and just, they looked at the auto train and said, "That is one beautiful train you got there, sir." It's all superliners. Now, like most people, I don't like to get up early in the morning. But I got to thinking, particularly with seeing things at Neabsco. Neabsco was a wonderful place in the afternoon. And I'd shot off and on, different times of day, but the lighting wasn't perfect. Well, what if I went to and it was hard to get a really good sunset at Neabsco. It just didn't happen very often based on the way the tracks were and timing of the sun, etc. So I thought, what if I dragged myself out of bed and went near sunrise and got down to Neabsco? What would I get? I wasn't disappointed. Now, don't want to do this time of year when the sun comes up at 5:50 a.m. because the commuter trains even have barely started running. In December, when the sun doesn't come up until about 7:45, that's quite another matter. You get a lot of VREs and Amtraks. So, without further ado, and I think you've been fairly patient in listening this far, what I'm going to do is just finish up with, well, you'll see why I've given it this title, hopefully. I'm not going to really talk to most of these with a couple exceptions. And sometimes the lighting is just spectacular. And of course, this lighting occurs before the sun actually comes up. I will put in a safety announcement. You've got to figure out how to get the sun in the frame of your picture without looking at it. In other words, you basically set the picture up, you push the camera so the sun is there, and then you immediately take your eye off it and push the shutter, looking at the scene, just like the camera is. And it is helpful to have the commuter trains. I remember this. It wasn't really, the temperature wasn't that bad, but it was cold and damp. It was below freezing, standing out on one of the docks at Neabsco, but was well rewarded with this shot. Colorful sky. I've tried a few pans down there. They work pretty well. Rumors was that the Hitchcock people were considering this location for a remake of The Birds, often active at sunrise. Also get some nice reflections if the water is still. Sometimes the sky appears to be closing in. This is like Jaws coming together. I wonder how many of the commuters actually see these beautiful sunrises. Because they probably either got their nose in something they're reading or looking at their tablet or sleeping. But they're missing a show. Hey, can even make a trash train look good. Really lit up that unoccupied cab on the rear. Of course, this is northbound, so it's not bothering anybody. It is a beautiful place to take pictures. And you also get to see substantial portions of the trains, to get them in the shot as well if you want. Under a full moon. Now this of course is in the evening. A few birds here. This is an exercise in geometric shapes. If you take a really careful look, that's a private car. Its name is the Chapel Hill. If you look in the very last window near the open platform, there is a silhouette of a single rider. My understanding was, I believe he has passed away since then, but a guy named Dwight Chappell owned this car. And I suspect that's him enjoying the sunrise. And he hadn't got his head down looking at something else. South end of the bridge at Neabsco. Orange sky. Silver meteor on its way to the south in the twilight. For some reason, on the front of Intermodal Train 135, they had these open top hoppers. I have no idea what was involved with this, but that and the color really made for sort of a neat and different scene. And thank you for listening. You've been patient, and I hope you've enjoyed. And what you're seeing here is the period at the end of the sentence. So now let's figure out how to get back to where I can give control of this to Bill.
All right.
Well, thank you, George. That was terrific. Yeah, I like that show at the end.
Really, really good. Thank you, George.
Yeah, very, very artistic, George, and regional favorite there. But he's been a favorite.
Questions for George or comments? Yeah.
George, how far away from Newsco are you? You got a lot of early morning alarms to get up and get that many wonderful shots.
Used to be about 40 minutes, Jim.
Yeah.
Now it's an hour and a half.
Oh.
So I think I've done it once since then.
Yeah.
Out here in the valley. Now, I when I looked at the number of photos I had of this, now not all of them have trains in it. That could be fun to do too. But
Right.
no, I've got, this was not the sum total of the shots by any means. So I think I can rest on that one.
All right. Well, those were wonderful.
Thank you. I
Yeah.
appreciate it.
You had to go to bed pretty early, I guess, night before, right?
Yeah, and there was the one awful morning when I got about 10 minutes away from home and realized that in my haste to get there, I had not taken my camera. And I managed to miss, because I could hear it on the radio, I managed to miss the train, but the good news that morning, the light really hadn't begun with the one I missed, although I probably would have found a way to shoot it anyway. But that was quite disconcerting. So I learned after that to take things a little more slowly and consciously as I exited the house in the morning.
We had a good show tonight, and hopefully we'll see a lot of you again next month for the for Jim Kleeman's show, and some in person and some on Zoom.